I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. This video I'm continuing my analysis into the occupation movement and social theory. Those of you who've been watching the series, you know that I'm using the third edition of Social Theory, the Multicultural and Classic Readings. I definitely recommend that you get the book. The book is, for me, an invaluable resource in presenting this information and tying it into the contemporary phenomena of the Occupy movement. This section is going to be section 3.1, and it's going to conclude our account and my interpretation and integration of Georg Simmel's account of the stranger in the Occupy movement. So this is going to be 3.1 in the notes. We're on page 14 of my notes. All you want to do is click the link in the description field. It'll take you to the PDF, download the PDF, use it to follow along, use it to just, keep notes and keep track of the analysis. With that, let's begin the discussion. So this is section 3.1 of Occupy Wall Street. Section 3.1. Okay, so this section is titled The Mobility and Objectivity of the Stranger. So the mobility and objectivity of the stranger. And as I've been doing in the past, what I'm going to do is read a section out of the author's text, do an analysis of the section, and then apply that analysis specifically to the occupation movement. So let's look at the first section. The stranger has, according to Georg Simmel, quote, 1. The appearance of this mobility within a bounded group occasions that synthesis of nearness and remoteness which constitutes the position of the stranger. Seems a little cryptic, but if you've watched the other section, section 3 of the analysis, then you understand what this means, right? The appearance of this mobility within a bonded group, we recognize the bond between the stranger and the group is one of attachment, right? And we also recognize that the detachment between the group are those characteristics that the stranger has that aren't in the group. And I talked about that in the last sort of hour and a half, 2 hours. Okay, so the appearance of this mobility within a bonded group occasions that synthesis of nearness and remoteness, attachment and detachment, which constitutes the position of the stranger. We understand that. He, 4, is not bound by roots to a particular constituent in partisan disposition of the group. He confronts all of these with 5, and this is what's important, distinctly objective attitude, right? The stranger confronts this positionality, the positionality between himself, herself, and the bonded group with objectivity. So distinctly objective attitude. An attitude that does not signify mere detachment and non-participation, but is a distinct structure composed of remoteness and nearness, indifference and involvement. Wow, okay, quite a bit, right? So what we've said, just a quick sort of rehash to get your mind warmed up, root us back into discussion of the positionality of the stranger for Simmel. We recognize that we have a group and there are characteristics which define the group, right? The characteristics which define the group. We have the positionality of the stranger, right? And there are characteristics which define the positionality of the stranger. Okay, so we have characteristics of the group, 1, 2, 3. We have characteristics of the stranger, 4, 5, 6. The characteristics of the stranger are not in a set term language, members of the set of the characteristics of the group, and vice versa. This relationship between the stranger and the group is a fixed relationship. Right? This relationship between the stranger and the group is a fixed relationship. As the group as the group expands or grows, as the group moves, conceptually speaking, the stranger remains in a constant relationship to the group. The group and the stranger, the relationship between the group and the stranger is one in which the stranger feels, and I talked about this before, the stranger feels the pressure to assimilate, to become part of the group. The group feels the pressure from the stranger's individuation, his excellence or her excellence, and thus the tension. So the group is tense, and this is sort of a combination of Nietzsche and Simmel. The group is tensed by individual excellence because now you're standing above and beyond the group, above and beyond the herd, if you will. The stranger is tensed, is not necessarily threatened, but feels the pressure to assimilate from the group, and thus this relationship is defined in Foucauldian terms, which I discussed several hours ago, entirely in terms of power and relationships of power. So now we have a more thorough understanding of exactly the nature of this relationship between the stranger and the group. Okay, so let's begin the synthesis, right? And this is where it gets interesting. Alright, so the synthesis. 1. The stranger is defined by mobility, right? When we're talking about the stranger, right, the stranger is defined by mobility. Defined by, right, the stranger is defined by mobility. Okay, so the stranger is defined by mobility. Group participation can define the stranger more than the occurrence of his or her participation. I'll say that again, and I'll say it slower. Group participation cannot define the stranger more than the occurrence of his or her participation. And what does that mean, right? The identity of the stranger is not defined by his or her participation with the group. In effect, the stranger is specifically defined by, at least one part, necessarily to be technical, is necessarily defined by his or her detachment from the group, right? There is a sense in which we talk about the stranger because the stranger isn't a part of the group. There's a relationship that the stranger has to the group, but the stranger isn't part of the mass. The stranger stands outside of, is individuated, is pointed to, is itemized, ostensively. That person is different from the rest of these people, in a sense, to be sort of ghetto about it, right? So, with respect to participation, group participation cannot define the stranger, right? Because insofar as the stranger is wholly immersed in group participation, the stranger loses his or her individuality. It seems sort of obvious now, right? More than the occurrence of his or her participation. So that's the first thing, right? So the stranger is defined by mobility, right? And this mobility, I didn't say in the notes, but this mobility sort of conceptually, and then I'll get more concrete later, the mobility is defined by an attempt to reinforce individuality, which looks something like this, or B, an attempt to assimilate. A-S-S-I-M-I-L-A-T, yeah. Assimilate, which looks something like this. Right? I'm reinforcing my individuality, I'm stepping outside of the group, I'm identifying myself as unique from the group, or the pressure to assimilate is so much that I'm moving away from my individuality to become part of the group. So the group is as such, right? The group is as such, and what happens, this sort of conceptual idea of mobility, and I'm going to take this deeper in a little bit, but this conceptual understanding of mobility pertains to the stranger, the individual's ability to move toward and assimilate or move away from and reinforce my individuality. Okay, number 2, the group, however, has definitive characteristics, and we know what those might be. I talked about some of the characteristics that the occupation movement has as definitive characteristics of that group. So a mic check is a definitive characteristic, right? At least at this point in time. The protests the protest, the placard